Hi guys, so in today's video lesson we are going to learn how to find the greatest common factor. So just like we learned about the lowest common multiple, this is very similar except this time it is the greatest common factor, or the GCF. Okay, so that stands for greatest common factor, GCF. So in this case, instead of lowest, now we're talking about the greatest. So this means that we're looking for the biggest number in a set, the greatest. Common still means that it's two numbers, or it's a number that two other numbers have in common or the same. And factor, well, we know what factors are, right? They're the small numbers that multiply together to make up the bigger numbers. So I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by greatest common factor. So if I want you to tell me what is the GCF of, let's do something simple to start, of 8 and 12. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to circle the two numbers that I need to find the GCF of. This helps me focus on these two numbers, and now I know exactly what I need to do. So when I'm looking for the factors, or the greatest common factor of 8 and 12, the first thing I want to do is list out my factors. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the factors of 8. Now this is different than what we've been doing this week, where we've been finding the multiples of a number. Now we're focusing on the factors, and these are what the factors are. The factors of 8 would be 1 times 8 and 2 times 4. So 1, 8, 2, and 4 are all factors of 8. Okay, so you'll remember when we learned how to find factors, sometimes we made a T-chart, right? So we would put 8 on the top, and then we would say 1 times 8, 2 times 4. And then when we looked at our multiplication chart, we could see that there were no more factors. So it's two different ways to do it. It doesn't matter. Whichever way is best for you is how you can find your factors. But these are the factors of 8. So now what we need to do is find the factors of 12. Factors of 12. So I'm going to use my T-chart for this one. Okay, so I'm going to put 12 at the top. And I know 1 times 12 equals 12. 2 times 6 equals 12, and 3 times 4 equals 12. So my factors of 12 are 1 times 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. So it looks like I have a lot of numbers here. So the next thing I'm going to do, and I would suggest that you do this also, is I'm going to circle all of the factors, just so I don't get mixed up. I'm going to circle my factors. So those are the factors of 8. And these are my factors of 12. So what I'm trying to find here is the greatest common factor. So I want to know, which factor do they have in common that is the biggest? So now I might choose to identify which factors they have in common. Okay, so I can see they definitely have 1 in common, right? 1 is a factor of both numbers. The next factor of 8 is 8. But I don't see 8 here, so they do not have 8 in common. I'm actually going to cross off 8, just so I can keep track of the numbers I've already looked at. Now I'm going to go to 2. Oops. And I see that 12 does have 2 in common. So 2 I'm going to highlight and say to myself, 2 is a factor that they have in common, so that's still in the running. And then the next factor, or the last factor of 8, is 4. So I'm going to look at the factors of 12 and see if that matches. And I can see here that 4 is a factor of 12. So I'm going to highlight 4. And then I know that these factors, 12, 3, and 6, are not a common factor because they're not factors of 8. So now I've highlighted the factors that the two numbers have in common, and that's 1, 2, and 4. But you'll notice that the GCF is the greatest common factor. So we want to find the biggest number that they have in common as a factor. And you probably already guessed it, 4 is the biggest factor that they have in common. So the GCF, or greatest common factor, of 8 and 12 is 4. All right, let's do another one because all of this may be a little bit confusing to you. So I'm going to simplify it with our next example. Okay, so let's do another example. Okay, and I want to find what is the GCF. And I will most likely be using the abbreviation of greatest common factor by saying GCF. So make sure you know what GCF stands for. This is the greatest common factor. Okay. What is the GCF of, let's go with 9 and 15. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is list my factors for both numbers. Okay, what are my factors of 9? So I'm going to list out the factors. The factors of 9 are 1, 9, and 3. There's no other set of numbers that can multiply together to make 9. So the only factors of 9 are 1, 9, and 3. You don't have to count the other 3 because we've already mentioned 3 as one of the factors. So 1, 9, and 3 are factors of 9. So now let's find the factors of 15. So I always start with 1 times that number because that is always going to be factors of a number. 1 times 15 and 3 times 5. So the factors of 15 are 1, 15, 3, and 5. So now we want to compare our two lists and figure out first of all, which factors do they have in common? But then we need to figure out, well, which is the biggest of those factors that they have in common. So we're going to run through our factors. Okay, so I like to just start with the list that's at one top. It doesn't matter which one you start with, but I'm going to start with the factors of 9 since that's my first number. So my first factor is 1, and I see that they definitely have 1 in common, right? They both have 1 as a factor. In fact, all numbers have 1 as a factor. So their first factor that they have in common is 1. So then I'm going to go to 9. I'm going to look down here and see, do they have 9 in common? And the answer is no, they don't. So I'm going to cross off the 9 because that is not a factor that they have in common. Then I'm going to go to my next factor, and that's 3. So I'm going to look down here at the factors of 15 and see, do they have 3 in common? And the answer is yes, they do. 3 is a factor that they have in common. So I don't have to go through 3 again, right? We've already talked about how 3 is a factor of 9 and 15. So now I'm going to go down here and just check the factors I have left. So 15, of course, is not a factor that they have in common, and neither is 5. So now I have the common factors 1 and 3. Those are the two factors that these numbers have in common. So all you have to ask yourself as the last step is, which one is bigger? And of course, we know that 3 is bigger than 1, so the greatest common factor is 3. All right, so that is how you find the greatest common factor. Remember, you can go back to the beginning of this video lesson and watch it again. Sometimes the best part about having these video lessons available to us is that we can go back and watch as many times as we need to. I know that I often can't learn a new concept unless I've watched a video at least 2 times. So I really do encourage you to go back to the beginning of this video and watch it one more time. That way, it'll really sink in and you may be able to understand better than you do right now. However, if you feel that this makes total sense to you and you are ready to get started with your practice, then go ahead and do that. But please do not feel like you can't go back and watch that again as many times as you need to. For today's greatest common factor assignment, I wanted to give you a quick overview of what you're going to be doing in this document. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is definitely go back to the stream in our Google Classroom and watch the greatest common factor video lesson. Okay, you're not going to know how to do this unless you watch that video lesson start to finish, and maybe even again if you need to. Then when you come to your page, the first thing you want to do is write down or type the factors of each number, and I encourage you to do this on a piece of paper first. So you might want to do it on a piece of scrap paper and then transfer your answers here into the box. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is list the factors of 24. So I'm going to do it by writing down the multiplication sentences that equal 24. So 1 times 24, comma, 2 times 12, comma, 3 times 8, comma, and 4 times 6. And those are the factors of 24. 1, 24, 2, 12, 3, 8, and 4, and 6. Okay, so now I'm going to go and list the factors of 30. 1 times 30, comma, 2 times 15, comma, 3 times 10. All right, so remember, you can use your multiplication chart to help you come up with the factors of these numbers. So the next thing I want to do is highlight the factors that they have in common. So we can see that, of course, they have 1 in common. So I'm going to highlight 1. Then 24. Doesn't look like 30 has 24. So that's not going to be one they have in common. Let's look at 2. It looks like they do have 2 in common. So this is not something that you should be rushing through. This is going to take some time. So you should not be rushing through this part. You really want to look at these numbers and identify and see which numbers they have in common as factors. So the next number here is 12. So I'm going to look down here and I don't see 12 as a factor of 30. So the next number is 3, and it looks like they do have 3 in common, so I'm going to highlight that. Highlight 3. The next number is 8, and 8 is not a factor of 30, so I'm going to move on to 4. And it looks like 4 is not a factor of 30. Oh, I just realized that I forgot a factor pair for 30. 5 times 6. Of course, silly me. Anyway, back to what I was doing. So 4 is not a factor for 30, so that is not a common factor. And then the last factor for 24 is 6. So if I look down here, I see that they do have 6 in common. So I'm going to highlight 6. And then I'm going to look at the numbers that I've highlighted, and I'm going to figure out which one is the biggest number that they have in common. And I can see that 6, the factors that they have in common is 1, 2, 3, and 6, and so 6 is the greatest common factor. And this should say 24 and 30. So the greatest common factor of 24 and 30 is 6. So you are going to work on numbers 1 through 5, and you're going to do it very similar to what I just did. You're going to list out the factors of both numbers, and then you're going to highlight the ones that they have in common, and then you're going to write down here, write which factor that they have in common that is the biggest number that they have in common.